we were joking with each other backstage that if it's true that 8% of the world's population is actually Indian women, we have 3 of that 8% right here with us today. So we thought we would have a short conversation really about this key issue, the anti-gender narrative and how it intersects with democracy. And what we're seeing is that authoritarianism, it rejects political competition and pluralism, clearly. And in many places, we're seeing a deliberate intent by strong men to usurp power, in part by promoting conservative and binary gender hierarchies. So that's in a way where we start. This is, if you're talking about democracy as a numbers game, if you can actually exclude, disencourage, or in any other way intimidate half the population, guess what? You may be winning in some way. But what does this do to the rest of us? How does it address some of the issues we've been discussing about the need for diversity and diverse voices in our policy agendas, in our implementation, and the voice and agency of all the different sectors of society that women of all in all their diversity represent. So enough from me. I'm going to turn immediately to Geeta. Give us a sense from your perspective of what are we talking about? Is it still just a narrative? Are we talking about more than that yet? Because from my point of view, it does seem that there is an enduring and persistent narrative, which is one about women's inequality, and the disempowerment of different genders, and that in some way women continue to be less than, and that has implications for all our democracies. So is it narrative, more than narrative, just misogyny, more than misogyny? Over to you.
Those are great questions, and I want to first thank the organizers for including me in this conversation because it's near and dear to my heart. I've been in this business for 40 years of promoting gender equality, and it hurts me deeply that we're in this place now. But it's not just misogyny, it's not just gender inequality that they're promoting, it is undermining democracy. There's a very close link between those two. As our Vice President in the US, Kamala Harris, once said, the status of women is the status of democracy. And intuitively, like you said, that's very understandable because if half the population is left out of civic life, is constrained in participation in any decision-making, then you have a weaker democracy. But there's also evidence to prove that link. There was a study that was done by Georgetown University that actually established a demonstrable link between the erosion of women's rights and 3 indicators of a democracy: election integrity, freedom of association and assembly, and balance of power between different branches of government. And what they found was a very strong correlation, and for the nerds in the audience, a statistically significant correlation at the 0.1 probability level between those indicators and women's status. So this is not just incidental or coincidental. This is a very direct way to try and undermine democracy by that unholy alliance of authoritarian leaders, of extreme fascist groups, of extreme religious right-wing groups coming together to undermine what they view to be as a threat. There was a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago that had this great line that said, authoritarianism and misogyny are not just coincidental comorbidities, they are mutually reinforcing ills. You know it by heart.
All hail Erica Chenoweth.
Yes, yes, exactly, and Zoe Marks.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
But I truly believe that this is done with intent.
Absolutely. So, Lopa, we are in a situation whereby only 14 countries in the world actually provide equal access to human rights between women and men. We're also understanding that of the top 4 autocratizers, by VDEM. VDEM, some of you will know the Varieties of Democracy Index. By VDEM's measurement, the top 4 autocratizers, being Afghanistan, Brazil, India, and Myanmar, they said that there was a correlation there also with a rollback on gender rights and human rights. What does it look like from your perspective, and particularly from that multilateral space perspective?
Thank you very much for that question, Sandra. And to the point that the same VDEM report that you're quoting also says that at this point in time, 72% of the world's population live in autocracies and what they call elected autocracies. So this plays itself out in the multilateral space. So what we are seeing in the multilateral space is an institutionalization of this de-democratization, an institutionalization of the pushback on gender equality. So it goes beyond sort of individual actors to actually political processes that look to undermine the ability of the multilateral system to make progress for gender equality. The multilateral system progresses for gender equality through diplomacy, through consensus building, through unified goals. And that space for disagreeable conversations towards leading to agreed upon goals, to leading towards global good governance, democracy, equality goals, that space is undermined because of this autocratization, which goes hand in hand with disinformation, misinformation, polarization. And so the space to have the conversations necessary to push forward for policy advancement for gender equality is very, very compromised within the multilateral space. And you're seeing these, the deep divisiveness, which is actually holding it to ransom entirely.
Absolutely. And that information piece, Mitra, coming to you, is one that I think we've heard a lot about even today, the pollution of the information space. But from where you sit, are you also seeing deliberate intent and deliberate political intent about polluting the information space, acquiring media? What does it look like from where you are?
Sure. So I think in so many ways, the narrative of gender inequality is actually a reflection of institutionalized violence against women, inequality against women. And in some ways, by calling it a narrative issue, I guess I just wonder if we're diluting the problem, right? That there are real forces at play. And in my business of media, we've often thought that information on its own is power, right? That if we relay this information to people, it will empower them. If we provide the good information, it might solve the problem. If we fix the narrative, it might solve the problem. And I think, at least for me, after 30 plus years of doing this, that alone is not the media's job. And so for me, who's worked at some of the biggest of the big news organizations in the world, right? CNN, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, you know, I feel like the equivalent, and this has been a theme of the day today as we talk about democracy, is that the media will kind of tell you, there's a problem, good luck to all of you, right? And I see you chuckling, because I imagine it's like this in a lot of organizations, right? Where we sort of believe that putting the information out there alone, the narrative might solve for the narrative. And so, you know, in this hopefully maybe latter half or however many years left I have on Earth, I really feel like I must undo the ills of the previous 35 years of my career, which was putting a lot of problems out there, but not quite solving them. Now, how does this relate to gender? All of us are gathered here because I presume that in your organizations, whether we're coming from government, arts and culture, nonprofits, media, that women are largely the doers of our organizations, right? That we are the ones that, in spite of these forces you're talking about, which tend to largely be men in charge, we are the ones, see internet as an example, that are kind of saving the place from itself, right? If you look at Facebook, launched as a website for someone to rank hot women at Harvard, and we have assigned the purpose of democracy to this platform, that's a misogynistic platform, right? So I see the role of media as one that's corrective, but also in partnership with service and financial empowerment and a lot of the other subjects that we've talked about for the last 2 days. To me, the media can no longer be this passive provider of information without going hand in hand with those solutions.
Great. Very powerful.
Thank you.
Well done, Mitra. Geeta, so how do we disrupt? How do we change this? What are the emerging strategies, networks, mechanisms that you're seeing?
So I want to build on something that you just said. It's not just that the media provides information and thinks that's their only duty. They also have this somehow, put on a pedestal this value of being neutral. But being neutral when you know that something is undermining what has been built over years is damaging. It's hugely damaging. So one, I think you're right that the narrative is not the only thing to change, but the media does play a role in shaping a narrative sometimes that makes it appear that there's a false equivalence between 2 points of view. And that's got to change. That's one. And I heard Christiane Amanpour speak about that very passionately the other day. The second is what's helped us in the past when we've had pushbacks of this kind, because it's happened before, not as severely, is the grassroots women-led groups, movements have stepped up and advocated for their rights. And they've done that within the halls of the UN, they've done that within to their own national governments, to their local governments. Those groups, ever since Beijing, are not funded in the same way. So I would say, and I say this all the time in every forum I get access to, is that we've got to help those groups survive and use the capacity that they have and sort of deliver their message, because they are the most credible. They can represent their own views, and we have shut their doors by closing off funding to them. So I would say that's an incredibly important first step. Second, we have all got to cooperate across social justice movements. This is a social justice progressive issue, and we're being pushed back by an unholy alliance of actors who have come together to push this agenda forward, that gender equality is somehow a bad thing, it's gender ideology, and they've co-opted our narrative of decolonization and made it seem as if rights is a colonial thing. To do that, we have to first collaborate and cooperate. We're not doing enough of that. We are, in fact, fighting between ourselves. We are disintegrating our own institutions that we have built over time. So, we are doing our bit as the US government through my office, trying to work with like-minded governments to put this agenda on squarely at the top of our list of priorities, because this is something that's undermining democracy. So how can we come together as like-minded governments to do something about this? But similarly, civil society actors, young people, leaders within organizations need to recognize, regardless of which social justice issue you represent, it's all part of the same progressive agenda, all linked to a democratic ideology that we want to promote. So how do we get everybody to work together? That would be my second big thing. So I think the media has a role to change the narrative, and I think that we have to learn to work together better. I've watched with great disappointment as organizations have imploded from within, because we're fighting each other.
And I think, one of the things, of course, is there are a whole lot of organizations these days who say that they're not media, but they're where we all go for our media, and that issue of who's governing them and their editorial capacity is an issue. And I think from your point, a lot of people don't even understand that because they are doing what they're doing, they are likely to be under attack by these forces as well. So again, that education about, if you think you're a progressive organization, you need to be thinking about how you protect yourself. Not just your cybersecurity, but how, to your point, your messaging doesn't get polluted as well. Lopa, what are you seeing as potential countering of this potential strategy?
I want to actually lift off from you as well, Geeta. So, what is actually happening? I fully agree, and I want to underline it, in unequivocal terms. All of the progress, all of the advancement that we have seen for gender equality has been because of the feminist movement. It's been because of feminist activists working with other stakeholders. So the effort of this de-democratization process has been to shrink the space for that feminist activism through legislation, through shrinking the space within the UN, through laws in countries. So the first and most important thing from where we sit within the multilateral space is to create the spaces for that feminist activism to thrive in countries, which means working on legislative measures, and within the UN and within the multilateral spaces to work together to create the spaces for the feminist activism to take place within bureaucracies, within governments, and with civil society. That's number one. Number two is absolutely to be able to fund, resource, and support grassroots feminist movements across intersectionalities. This is absolutely crucial. And then the third thing is absolutely to build the alliances that are necessary. Because what is happening is the delegitimization of the global governance structure. So we need to build the alliances across states, across civil society, across the UN and other stakeholders to uphold those global governance structures and to in fact reaffirm the centrality of those global governance structures as an accountability measure, which in turn also holds, for example, media accountable. But I mean, the reason, one of the reasons why you're saying what you're saying is because there are no guardrails anymore. And that's what, in some ways, the global governance system provides, is guardrails. And so to be able to build those alliances to keep those guardrails intact.
I think yesterday, Obi challenged us on the legitimacy of the current global governance structures in terms of how inclusive and responsive they're being to our 21st century issues. But I hear you. I hear you with regards to the importance of at least those normative issues, if not the actual structures. Mitra, last word.
Yeah, oh gosh, the last word. There's so much still. So please, let's keep this conversation going beyond this square, if you will. The first, I think, is to lean into the other part of our title, networks. So I would just pick up on what you said in terms of working together. So URL Media is a network of 25 Black and Brown-led news organizations around the United States. We intentionally leverage each other as opposed to thinking one kind of small outlet can take on Google's algorithm, right? The power of 25 networks 25 media organizations means we have an audience of about 28 million. So suddenly you stand a chance with these platforms that are largely, to your point, unregulated, which I would say our global regulation, thank you to Europe for getting this kind of moving on that front. But really, my preference would be that we start there because so much of the conversation has been ceded to these spaces. And just because they don't favor journalism anymore doesn't mean that people aren't filling those gaps with very bad information.
Exactly.
And so for us, it's a dual focus right now of banding together to try to get to be as big so that people pay attention to us online, and then arming people with good information to combat the bad. The other area that I would just encourage all of us to think about is the role that female voters play in democracy. And so in the US, mainstream media, largely governed by men, has a strategy of interviewing Black women in the last week of October before our November elections, right? In our network, we really try to center women, especially women of color, all year long in their concerns, because it's going to come down to this voting bloc anyway. And we always historically act surprised. And this is not just the US, because I've talked to people in other countries, and certainly in the case in India, we sort of act surprised when it comes down to a particular group of people. And so I would just encourage us, and I say this as much for our media, to center women and women voters throughout our coverage and process of elections, as opposed to just at the end of the process.
Right. So that's it. For now, I think the conversation must go on, because I think it is a clear and present danger. Let's use that term. It's a clear and present danger to all of us. We've tried to name it today. We want to work in solidarity with each other, and we have to fund these feminist organizations, because the other side is very well funded and hugely powerful. Thank you. We're done.
Thank you.
Thank you.